and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, can new South Korean President Moon Jae-in rise up to the challenge of denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula? How can the Belt and Road Initiative contribute to the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Goals? And we begin today's show with this new South Korean President Moon Jae-in, who has been thrusted into office at a time when relations with the DPRK are at one of the lowest points in history. How will his policies on Pyongyang shape the region's landscape? And how will he handle the relations with longtime ally, the United States, and other neighboring countries? We will go to our panel before this background story.
Moon Jae-in, the son of refugees who fled the north during the Korean War, who became a soldier, then a medical doctor turned civil rights lawyer, then a politician, and now he is the 19th president of South Korea. But there's no time to waste, as he has been thrusted into the spotlight, responsible for toning down tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Moon is a descendant of South Korea's Sunshine Policy, which favored engagement and dialogue with Pyongyang, rather than sanctions and pressure.
If needed, I will fly straight to Washington. I'm willing to go to Beijing, Tokyo, and if conditions are right, to Pyongyang. I will do everything possible to have a settled peace on the Korean Peninsula.
Moon has also called for international efforts to diffuse tensions. After he was officially sworn in, he held phone calls with the leaders of China, the United States, and Japan, urging for solutions. Speaking to Chinese President Xi Jinping, the two leaders agreed that denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula was their common goal, and willing to relaunch the long-stalled six-party talks. Another important issue President Moon must deal with is the deployment of the U.S. THAAD missile defense system on the Korean Peninsula. On the campaign trail, Moon had argued the new incoming administration should handle the future of THAAD through the nation's legislature.
If a THAAD motion passes in a vote at the National Assembly and must be withdrawn under the circumstances, how will President Moon handle that type of situation? I believe figuring this out will be his very first task.
Moon also faces domestic challenges like low economic growth, a rising household debt, and job shortages. But most importantly, many will be watching to see if Moon can bring cohesion to a nation left reeling in the wake of a political scandal.
So how will Moon Jae-in's administration in South Korea do to handle the relations? Let's find out with our panel in our Beijing studio. Zhao Tong, who is with the Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program based at Tsinghua Carnegie Center for Global Policy. Welcome to our program. Joining us in Tokyo, we invited Oh In-yu, who is a professor at Korea University. He's joining us now in Tokyo temporarily. In Washington, D.C., we have Jonathan Pollack, who is the interim South Korea Foundation Chair in Korea Studies in the Center for East Asia Policy at the Brookings Institution, a well-known scholar in this field worldwide. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to, first of all, get your opinion, Professor Oh, about the latest statements coming from the South Korean new president, Mr. Moon Jae-in, about having six-party talks, and also about even possible to talk to the North.
Well, this is well expected, and we believe that he would take measures like this right after his election. People knew, probably more than 40% of Koreans knew that he would be elected, and the first thing he would do is to ease tension on the peninsula by assuring his visits to China and Pyongyang itself. I think many people are welcoming that position, and his clear statement about his willingness about new diplomatic policies from the Blue House, which is probably will be very different from previous governments.
Mr. Zhao, Mr. Moon, during his telephone conversation with the Chinese President Xi Jinping, he not only talked about the possibility of six-party talks, but also focusing on talks and dialogue, while at the same time he's talking about what he called the pragmatic strategic cooperation partnership with China. There's a lot of adjectives in front of the cooperation partnership, but those adjectives sound very significantly, in fact.
Yes, indeed, especially if we consider the fact that the bilateral relationship has been at a historical low during Mrs. Park's presidency. So there is high hope both in Beijing and Seoul that the two countries can rebuild their relationship. And it's very important that the two presidents talk to each other directly, which can contribute to a direct personal relationship at the very top level. And also at the operational level, Mr. Moon has mentioned he's going to send two envoys to both talk about DPRK and the THAAD issue. So substantive dialogues at the operational level are also going to take place. That is also very important to reduce misunderstandings and promote real progress.
We'll see what's going to happen. There seems to be a lot of going on all at the same time. Mr. Pollack, I'm sure as a scholar who's been researching about the issue for decades, you're very excited about all the latest development.
Well, I think it's very important, Tianwei, to recognize that although relations between China and the ROK have been in serious decline over the last year or more, prior to that they were actually very, very good. Former President Park traveled to Beijing in September 2015, stood on the rostrum at Tiananmen, and so forth. She had many meetings with Xi Jinping, so it's only been more recently and that the relationship has turned negative. And very frankly, there's a lot of rebuilding that has to go on here. At the present time, China is less popular in South Korean public opinion than even Japan. And that's because, in part, China decided to take major economic reprisals against South Korea, take other measures to punish South Korea for the decision on THAAD, which I think now has to be rectified.
Mr. Pollack, there seems to be a lot of going on. It is not just about China and South Korea. Certainly there's something has to do with the United States. The THAAD system, for example. The ruling Democratic Party of Korea has called on, their special panel, called on to have a parliamentary hearing on the deployment of THAAD. We understand, Mr. Pollack, THAAD now is partly implemented, but only partially operational. So this is a very interesting moment and certainly a very important proposal coming from the ruling party. Mr. Pollack.
Yes, it is, and President Moon had promised as candidate that he thought that the power to make ultimate decisions here should rest with the new government. My own expectation, though, is that President Moon will recognize that there is a reason for the THAAD deployment. I know that China has major reservations about this, but the fundamental reality is that this is a defensive missile system to protect against North Korean missiles. We know how active North Korea has been in this area, many times even simulating missile attacks on South Korea. So that has to be first and foremost, I think, in any deliberations that are undertaken within the new ROK government.
Well, Washington probably needs to favor the current plan, but Washington also faces, Mr. Pollack, if I could be frank, the challenge that there has to be a continuity between this ally relationship between Seoul and Washington. And can Washington afford that by keep on pushing about that? That's another question. But for now, I want to go to you, Professor Oh. Before we do that, take a look at what Mr. Moon Jae-in's campaign promises. He seeks to improve relations with DPRK while keeping sanctions and pressure. And this contrasts to Park Geun-hye, the previous president, who cut almost all ties with Pyongyang. Mr. Moon also has talked about reforming South Korea's chaebols, those big family-run conglomerates that dominate the domestic economies. But I guess, Mr. Oh, at this point, it is really the geopolitical relations that people are looking at. It is really the THAAD deployment that people are looking at. It is really the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula that people are really looking at. Professor Oh.
Well, the issues are very clear here. Between China and South Korea is THAAD deployment. And the first thing that Mr. Moon did after election is to stop the installment going on further. So that's a clear message to China that he's willing to talk. Number two, he's issuing domestic policies, very radical domestic policies of reforming Jebel again. And also number three, he's talking to Russia and North Korea, probably by indirect means, of course. But nonetheless, it's very clear message that he's willing to reopen Kaesong plant
industrial zones
establishment over there. Plus, and he's willing to talk to North Korea about peace rebuilding process here. And the most important thing is to resolve all the misunderstanding between China and South Korea regarding THAAD, because it is number one very important for South Korea, even for Mr. Moon himself, to protect and defend South Korea from northern invasion through missile means. So everybody has to be very clear here. The problem comes from North Korea. We need to talk through six-party talks, probably, to stop the threat from the North first. That's, I think, the beginning understanding that all has to make before we directly talk to North.
Right. Mr. Zhao, what about that plan that Professor Oh from South Korea just mapped out? Is that going to be possible? After all, six parties involve six parties.
Yes, I think if we look at the big picture, with the persistent threat from North Korea's nuclear and missile programs, with the U.S. continuous efforts to continue with the deployment of THAAD, it is impossible for South Korea to reverse the deployment overnight. And I think the ideal scenario would be, given the pro-engagement approach of Mr. Moon Jae-in, he could really work very well with China to engage with North Korea to greatly improve North-South relationship, to reduce regional tensions. And that can create conditions to reduce threat perceptions in Seoul and in Washington. And that can lead to a reconsideration of the deployment. But at this moment, in the near term, I think all stakeholders should be prepared to engage with some mid-term, mid-ground solutions, which means everyone needs to make some compromises. For example, U.S. Might consider some modification to the THAAD system to greatly reduce its threat to China, or to invite Chinese inspectors to the site of the deployment. All those technical solutions can pave the way for more radical measures towards the canceling or withdrawal of the THAAD in the future.
Mr. Oh, from the South Korean perspective, isn't that interesting that Professor Moon, in a way, seemed to kept all possibilities open? He's working on the THAAD system, some negotiations and discussion about it, probably with the parliamentary hearings. He's also working on with China about opening more gates to talk to North Korea, possibly directly, and the six-party talks. He's also working with the United States on some of the issues as well. With all of these options in his hand, what do you think might be the factors that will eventually help him to make some of the most important decisions, Professor Oh?
I think we should first work with United States, especially President Trump, for the understanding of the missile deployment, this missile defense deployment in South Korea first. I think that's the priority here. And that priority is same as the second priority that we need to require from the Chinese government, that THAAD, the purpose of THAAD is not to attack or to surveil China, but to defend South Korea from possible northern missile attacks. But I think the problem really is between South Korea and Japan at the moment, because President Moon is not taking any issues about the comfort women issue with Japan at all. So I think that will be a backfire a little bit in his early presidential term.
You know, Mr. Polak, when you have six-party talks, you're going to see every party seem to bring out what seem to be the issues as they claim to be the most important ones. And yet that makes the discussion really bogged down by all kinds of things. And that was also one of the reasons why the earlier rounds of six-party talks were not that successful. Mr. Polak, do you think there are momentums coming from all sides to make it possible this time?
I think what you're seeing now is a period of maneuvering and fluidity, not so much on the basis of any kind of resumed six-party process at this point, certainly, but more how each state adjusts its interests and its discussions and its relationships with one another. Because if you cannot get to reasonable understandings at those levels, there's really no logic or justification for resumption of the six-party talks.
Okay, Mr. Polak,
may
I just follow up on that, what you just said, to make it clear?
Please.
What are the things you think, Mr. Polak, that the current Trump administration and also the apparatus in Washington need to understand and adjust their positions?
Well, actually, the good news right now is that the concerns that were so much evident during March and April, fears of another nuclear test, fears of a long-range missile test, have not occurred. This suggests actually to me that the process of enhanced pressure and indeed a much more coordinated strategy between the United States and China may have been having some real effect. We have to see if that's sustained over a longer period of time. But what's important now is that there's a new Korean government, so the Korean voice coming from Seoul will be heard much more loudly and prominently than it has been in this period of protracted political crisis in South Korea. But I think you also must remember, Tianwei, that President Moon's fundamental priorities are domestic, at least as much as they are international. And in this respect, his party does not have a majority in the National Assembly in Seoul. So that therefore he has to find a way to build coalitions of interest across the political divide in South Korea if he is going to make significant headway and progress.
That's exactly what I really want to follow up with, but you have already said it, Mr. Polak. Therefore, I want to throw it back to Mr. Zhao here in Beijing. I mean, you see, President Moon has his agenda, and yet he has to work with everybody in order to achieve main parts of his agenda. Mr. Zhao, at this point, how sustainable will this wonderful period of Seoul-Beijing relationship be, given what is going on inside South Korea earlier? Meanwhile, how sustainable from the Chinese perspective does China-US relationship be at this point on the issue of Korean Peninsula? There seems to be some consensus going on already. How sustainable that will be, Mr. Zhao?
Well, I think you are exactly right. I'm a little concerned, in fact, that Mr. Moon Jae-in might exhaust himself. He is preoccupied with domestic issues, and on the foreign policy front, he has committed to visiting all countries, US, China, North Korea, even Japan, and sending envoys to all countries. And so he's really spending efforts everywhere. So how to maintain the momentum, I think that's really important. I think he's making a right choice to reach out directly to the other national leaders. He's probably going to DC very quickly, and hopefully he's coming to Beijing soon. And directly meeting with those national leaders would go a long way to pave the ground for building basic common understandings on what's the grand strategy to deal with the most perplexed issues like North Korea, like that. I think that's critically important. And also he is sending operational level envoys to all capitals, and those operational level coordination is also critically important in exploring the substances of these different opinions. So I think he's doing something right, but I hope he can strike the right balance between domestic and foreign policy issues.
And you know, Professor Oh, from the South Korean perspective, I guess, this is really a window opportunity. I mean, he's fresh in the office, he's fresh in his approach to everybody as far as he is the president. So that window opportunity should not and cannot afford it to be missed. Professor Oh.
I couldn't hear.
That's a window opportunity, isn't it, for South Korea?
Yeah, it is a good opportunity for President Moon, but he's facing a lot of difficulties because, number one, like other people said today, that he's facing problems from North Korea directly, but also inside. Domestic opposition is very strong. He doesn't have the majority in the party, in the parliament, so he has to work with coalition parties if he's lucky enough to find. The only thing he got in the domestic politics is 40% supporters, and that's not enough. And number two, he's facing Abe in Japan, and who is willing to talk to him about the historical problems, resolve historical problems somehow. That's very difficult to me. More difficult than South or North Korean issues because he knows how to deal with those problems initially, although he doesn't know how to deal with Japan.
Wow, Professor Oh, you are putting a lot of pressure on your new president. But he is having a lot of pressure at this point. But I want to thank the three of you, gentlemen, for being with us, helping us to get the latest insights on this very crucial issue. Zhao Tong, Oh Yingyu, Jonathan Polak, thank you so much. Have a great weekend. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing. Still to come on our program. How can the Belt and Road Initiative contribute to the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Goals? We're going to answer that question with our panel later. We live in a globalized world. For the past century, globalization has brought greater connectivity, but also increased inequality as the side effect. Belt and Road Initiative, which brings infrastructures and jobs, is offering another solution for common prosperity, something the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is also looking for. After the U.S. confirmed Friday that they will send a delegation to attend the BRI Forum, the Belt and Road Initiative Forum, all 5 permanent members of the United Nations, in fact, they will all gather in Beijing with their delegations next week. We will talk about the ties between the BRI and the UN, but first, take a look at this.
Cooperation agreements with over 40 countries, an investment of over $50 billion, 56 economic cooperation zones with 20 countries, the creation of more than 180,000 jobs. Over 3 years since Chinese President Xi Jinping first came up with a Belt and Road Initiative, its early successes are exciting, even to the United Nations.
When one looks at the Belt and Road Initiative, we see a very important contribution to this solidarity in addressing global problems with international cooperation, where China plays a very central role.
2 years ago, the UN adopted a set of goals to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure prosperity for all as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Each goal has specific targets to be achieved over the next 15 years. For Guterres, the BRI can be a very important instrument to meet the new agenda, while the biggest question achieving the maximum possible value. And that has long been a vision of Chinese President Xi Jinping.
China will continue to contribute to global development. We will continue to pursue common development and the win-win strategy of opening up. We welcome other countries to board China's express train to development.
The coming BRI summit will be the best demonstration of China's sincerity. So far, 29 heads of state and government have confirmed plans to attend the forum, which will be the highest-level international meeting since its proposal. The China-hosted international forum will prove useful at a time when there is doubt about the merits of globalization.
And for more on this, we have in our Beijing studio Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department for European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies, and Nicholas Rossellini, who is the Resident Coordinator of the United Nations in China, who is also a resident representative of UNDP, United Nations Development Program, here in this country. Welcome, gentlemen, to both of you. I want to start with you, Mr. Rossellini, about the United Nations role and China's initiative on the Belt and Road. How does that work together?
Well, I see them as 2 very important global initiatives that are really coming together at the moment. The SDGs...
Sustainable Development Goals, 17
yes.
of them.
Yeah, I mustn't use jargon. Sustainable Development Goals. Those were agreed by all the member states of the United Nations back in 2015, and 2016 was the first year of implementation. It gives a universal framework to make the lives of everyone around the world better, regardless of people living in a rich or a poor country, a developed country or a developing country.
SDG was also the ones being passed by the UN when the Chinese President Xi Jinping was there to attend the assembly meeting.
And China's really become now, since then, a champion of the SDGs, both domestically in terms of incorporating it into China's own development planning, as well as internationally in terms of supporting it in international fora and creating trust funds and investment for the sustainable development
goals. But what about BRI? I mean, Belt and Road Initiative, how does that work together?
Well, the Belt and Road Initiative is coming from a slightly different direction. It's coming from the idea of connectivity, infrastructure. But if you look at the SDGs, that is also looking for improving infrastructure, for creating jobs, as well as continuing to improve services such as health and education. So the Belt and Road Initiative is actually very much a platform that can help accelerate the delivery of the SDGs.
Are we going to see redundancy of the projects, or actually projects going to complement one another, and the roles of the United Nations or the roles of the countries involved on the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, going to complement one another?
We are trying to find out some connectivity or some integration between the SDG and the BRI. Yes, once we have some more projects on the BRI and in some especially countries alongside the road and the belt, certainly we can find out the embody of this SDG. Otherwise, we just have something on table. We could not have something, to show how is efficiency and how is this implementation of SDG.
That's right. It seems that China is eager, together with many partners along the Belt and Road Initiative, try to have some lower hanging fruits, to have some early harvest, as an example, so that the others also want to follow suit and also be more inspirational. So, Mr. Rossellini, I guess this has a lot to do with how SDG has been doing and working here in China. You and your colleagues working a lot on the public-private partnerships. Will there be experiences, lessons learned in those practices that could help with the BRI initiative?
I think they can certainly support each other. What the SDGs say is that it's not just about what your goals are in terms of improving people's lives and their well-being. It's also about what kind of partnerships you need to achieve those goals and where the resources are coming from, what kind of financing is available. And I think for the first time in terms of the international development community, we're trying to work very closely together with all parts of society, not just with governments and member states, but also with the private sector and with civil society. And we're looking at a bill for the SDGs which could approach, for developing countries, $2 to $3 trillion a year.
All right.
The envelope for the whole world, developed and developing, is $5 to $7 trillion a year. And no one can do this by themselves. It needs the support of the international community through traditional development cooperation assistance. It needs countries like China with the South-South cooperation. But as you're referring to now, it needs the private sector. The private sector has to see itself as a stakeholder and a player in these achievements. And again, I think the Belt and Road Initiative, which has a focus on the private sector, is a very good delivery mechanism.
Is it misconception or not that many around the world believe the Belt and Road Initiative mainly is one coming from the Chinese government, and it's mainly state-owned enterprises and companies that are involved in it? But listening to what Mr. Rossellini had to say, it seems that it is much more than that.
Yes, of course. As we know that this initiative was proposed by Chinese government, but we can find also the principle from this initiative, according to even some official document from China, say that it will be open, it will be inclusive. And also I have a very deep impression about this PPP model, just like
public-private partnership once again.
According to the principle of Belt and Road Initiative, which means that we could reach a win-win cooperation. So we have to ask a question, who will be the winner?
Right.
Not only on the government or state-to-state level, not only China and some other country or other government will be the winner, especially in the background of some deglobalization. We need to take care more about how about these the different stakeholders and also these beneficiaries, not only government, not only country, and also average people, and also business, and also especially the public service.
Both of you have been working in very different countries, emerging and developing countries. You worked in Vietnam, in Pakistan, Bhutan, Ethiopia. You also work in the Caribbean countries, South Asian countries. You know, sometimes it's very hard to bring people on a level playing field when it comes to mentality. So how to convince people to be on the same platform with you?
What we can do in the UN, we have a large presence in most of the Belt and Road countries. We have our country offices there.
And for decades.
And for decades. They know the local environment, the local situation. They have good relations with the local government.
Right.
And they can help to position these kind of investments under the BRI into the local framework so that the local needs and priorities, the local policy, regulatory frameworks can be utilized or improved if needed through capacity building so that the investments coming from China can have the maximum impact.
Mr. Rossellini, you've been working on a daily basis with your colleagues around the Asia-Pacific region.
Yeah.
You know, what exactly are the most urgent needs from them?
You mentioned already I was working in Pakistan in the past, and I've just come back from a visit to some countries in Africa. And I mean, just from those impressions from those kind of countries, what is really important is energy. That many of these countries are energy deficient. This is delaying or slowing down their industrialization. And the multiplier effects of energy, access to energy, is very big. I mean, it can make a big boost on production, whether you're talking about large-scale manufacturing, whether you're talking about small-scale enterprises. Everyone needs energy. And certainly, there's a big role, I think, for China in supporting the development of energy, hopefully renewable energy, green energy, but the development of energy in these countries.
To bring in the sustainable component of it, to bring in the environmentally friendly component of it, China is still in a learning process of that. So it has to involve other partners, it seems, in order to achieve it. Mr. Rossellini, your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, China's made enormous leaps and bounds in terms of green technology. I mean, it's now the largest market for electric vehicles. It's the largest producer, and I think also installed capacity of
photovoltaic. But it's not just the green technology.
Yeah.
It has to be all throughout the process when it comes to green.
Yeah. Well, we are at the Belt and Road Forum. We'll be launching a report on called the Global Governance Report, and that will make some policy recommendations on how to really focus on making the Belt and Road Initiative fully aligned with the attainment of the SDGs, particularly in terms of sustainability, social sustainability.
Give us some preview. How?
Well, I think we have to break it down into on the China side with the private sector. How do we sensitize private companies in China to the need to go green?
Yes.
And that includes some ideas on setting up sustainable investment centers to raise awareness about some of the issues involved. And then on the partner countries side, it means looking at their own framework, their own capacities, their own institutions, their own policy frameworks, their own regulation, and also in the enforcement. I mean, it's often you need a strong partner on both sides to make things work well. And I think if we have that and a common understanding that sustainable investment is what we're looking for, then we can move ahead.
You know, that reminds me of a very important point, Mr. Cui. That is, some people believe the BRI is just about China. It's about China providing the money, providing the technology, providing the labor force, or providing this and that. But actually, it is a vision under which China can work with all the other countries along the BRI together. And according to what Mr. Rossellini just said, it's impossible for China to go into those countries and operate and fulfill all of these requirements, as you just mentioned. So the local partners becoming extremely important.
Nice.
And meanwhile, the understanding that this is not about China, this is about we together,
yes,
is extremely important, Mr.
Yes.
Cui.
Yeah, it's right. I think that firstly, we need to make clear that yes, this initiative was proposed by China, but it not belongs to China. So I think it's a very clear attitude from Chinese government. So that's the reason why at this moment China tried to have this high-level forum. I think one of the very important goal for this forum is to get some more consensus on how could we do something together. China and some countries or some partners, we need to do something to have some concrete project. If so, we can have some more convincing, proofs to persuade more and more stakeholders, more and more
Both of you talk about concrete projects. Let's have that lower hanging fruits. But infrastructure projects, it takes years to build, first of all, and secondly, to see the benefits of it.
Right.
It's a gradual process. So what kind of lower hanging fruit that we can really talk about, that we could throw to those leaders at the upcoming summit for them to discuss, and with that to come up with some, what you just mentioned, real strategies, real coordination policies. Mr. Cui.
Yes, I think firstly, besides this state-to-state or government-to-government level, now China or some other partners want to have some deeper or some more local cooperation. For example, now between China and Europe countries, not only on the central government level, now we do have some local government level discussion and some cooperation.
Not just discussion anymore. We want to see the lower hanging fruit. So what are those projects you can help us to understand?
Yes. Also at the same time, we need to make clear that we should have some more, economic consideration or some more benefits model exchange. So that's the reason why I mentioned it before that how could we implement a kind of a PPP model.
It's all about we can, and then we can. Yes, we can, but we are trying to look for lower hanging fruit.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to figure out what those could be.
Well,
is Pakistan example? You were in Pakistan, and will that be a good example for the rest of the world? Will that be the model?
Well, I think if you're looking for low-hanging fruit, there's already been considerable investment in infrastructure. I think in the case of Pakistan, there's already a strong industrial base there, but they are very energy deficient. And I think in the case of Pakistan, to find ways to increase energy production there, both short and long term, would be what is needed.
I'm sure when you were talking to your colleagues in the Asia-Pacific region, Mr. Rossellini, they would ask you, so what has China got in mind? And I'm sure you have a better idea. What usually you would tell them?
I think what the world needs now are more global partnerships. I mean, globalization has achieved a lot in the last 20 years. It's not been all perfect. I mean, some people maybe have lost out because of globalization, but largely speaking, it's helped to dramatically reduce poverty. It's dramatically increased the size of economies. And we need more of these platforms that allow for global connections. And this is one of them, and it's very much something that we should be supporting.
We are sitting in this studio in Beijing with the backdrop of the ancient Silk Road. And our ancestors were smart enough to do trades by creating roads and routes on their own. And now we hope with more coordination and real policies, we can lead it to a better road and better Belt and Road Initiative. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Nicholas Rossellini and Cui Hongjian. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight with Tianwei's CGTN in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tianwei, and everyone on the World Insight with Tianwei team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights from across China and around the world. Have a great weekend.